The Habsburg dynasty faced many challenges during their rule. One of their biggest struggles was the 30 Years' War, impacting nearly all European nations. It started as a religious fight between Protestants and Catholics, but quickly turned into a political contest. This conflict escalated into a fight between Europe's most powerful families for dominance. The Holy Roman Empire in the 17th century was a divided land. Dozens of small territories existed, with the emperor's authority existing mostly in name. 7 influential leaders held the power to elect the emperor. However, the imperial crown wasn't highly desired, as it mainly led to losses, so it became permanently linked to the Habsburgs. This political division was made worse by a deep religious split. Protestants were dominant in the north of the empire, while the south remained Catholic. The 1500s saw multiple religious wars, concluding with the Peace of Augsburg. This peace allowed each ruler to decide the faith within their own lands. Yet neither side truly accepted this truce, aiming to destroy their rivals. The Protestants formed the Evangelical Union, and their opponents created the Catholic League. Emperor Matthias I maintained a moderate religious approach. He was fair to Protestants and aimed for peace within the empire. Even so, his inner circle was much more extreme. This included his cousin and successor, Archduke Ferdinand. He is famously quoted as saying, "I would rather rule a desert than a state full of heretics." So, it wasn't unexpected that these words proved to be prophetic. Bohemia, though part of the Habsburg Empire, possessed many rights and freedoms. True authority rested with the local parliament, the Diet, composed of the aristocracy. During the 1400s, a local Protestant movement arose in Bohemia. This was the Hussite movement, named after Jan Hus. He was a theologian who challenged Catholic Church doctrines. He also introduced his own simplified version of Christianity for the Czech people. This led to the Hussite Wars. The Hussites won several notable battles but eventually lost. A segment of the Hussites, known as the Chalice faction, succeeded in preserving their right to practice their form of Christianity. They also remained the dominant political group in the kingdom. By the 1500s, Lutheranism and Calvinism spread from Germany into Bohemia. This made Bohemia primarily a Protestant region. For a time, the Habsburgs, who favored Catholicism, did not object. In fact, Emperor Rudolf II even made Prague his capital city. The situation shifted as the childless Matthias I neared his end. Archduke Ferdinand was already preparing to take over the leadership. In 1617, the Archduke arrived in Prague. During his coronation, he declined to guarantee he wouldn't infringe upon Protestant religious freedoms. The following year, the king's representatives started shutting down Protestant churches. In response, on May 23rd, the Defenestration of Prague took place. A group of Protestants stormed Prague Castle and hurled 3 royal officials out of the windows. A revolt quickly spread throughout Bohemia. The rebels seized Prague, confiscated the property of local Catholics. They also assembled an army to fight against the Habsburg rulers. Additionally, the Evangelical Union hired General Ernst von Mansfeld's troops. These soldiers were intended to aid the insurgents. It was Mansfeld's hired soldiers who seized the crucial fortress of Plzeň. This move blocked the advance of Catholic mercenaries preparing to enter Bohemia. In the summer of the following year, Czech forces, under Heinrich Matthias von Thurn, marched towards Vienna. However, they were unable to lay siege to the city. Count de Bécoy defeated Mansfeld's mercenaries at the Battle of Sabzlet. Thurn was compelled to return to his homeland. The Czech rebels extended an offer of the crown to Elector Palatine Frederick V. He accepted their proposal to lead them. The Czechs also received support from Transylvanian Prince Gabriel Bethlen. He invaded Habsburg territories with his own military force. He even briefly put Vienna under siege. Yet, a complicated political situation in Hungary forced him to retreat. He did, however, leave his soldiers to fight for the Czechs. While Bethlen was near Vienna, Ferdinand was occupied with his own imperial elections. It wasn't until 1620 that he shifted his focus to the rebellious Czechs. Catholic forces, led by the skilled commander Johann von Tilly, advanced on Prague. There, they encountered the Protestants close to White Mountain. The Catholics held an advantage in both troop numbers and quality. Count Tilly personally led the charge, causing the Transylvanian mercenaries to flee the field. The German soldiers soon followed, retreating as well. The Czechs fought bravely until the very end, with many preferring death to escape. King Frederick fled as soon as he heard about the defeat. Due to his very short time as king, his enemies sarcastically named him the Winter King. In Bohemia, self-governance was abolished, and the Czech nobility lost their privileges. A process of Catholicization was initiated across the land. After dealing with the Bohemian uprising, Emperor Ferdinand II then targeted Frederick's German territories. In the summer of 1620, Spanish forces occupied the Rhenish Palatinate. Only the capital remained unconquered, where a garrison, bolstered by English mercenaries, defended it for a full year. During this period, the Upper Palatinate was occupied by Bavarians, who would eventually claim it. The emperor proposed to revoke Elector Frederick's titles and confiscate his lands and clothes. Some princes protested this decision, viewing it as an attack on their own rights, and raised armies against the emperor. General Mansfeld's army still remained. Despite its defeat in Bohemia, it was not eliminated and moved westward. Count Tilly pursued them. At the Battle of Mingolsheim, Mansfeld even managed to hold off this pursuit. In May of that same year, Count Tilly defeated the Baden forces at Wimpfen. After several more losses for the Protestants, General Mansfeld, sensing defeat in Germany, enlisted in the war in the Netherlands, where victory chances were much higher. Count Tilly defeated Christian of Brunswick twice, forcing him to depart Germany and join military service in the Netherlands. Afterward, he captured Heidelberg, fully occupying the Palatinate. For a few years, peace settled over the empire, though further conflict loomed. After their setbacks, the Protestant princes sought outside assistance for another attempt. Alongside Protestant allies like England and the Netherlands, they found an indirect supporter in Catholic France. The skilled politician Cardinal Richelieu saw the Habsburgs, who encircled France, as his nation's primary threat. Therefore, despite being a Catholic cardinal, he was prepared to fund Protestants to weaken the Habsburgs. Almost all subsequent military actions in this war would be financed by France. King Christian IV of Denmark became a more direct ally. The Danes, who practiced Protestantism, did not want powerful Catholics in nearby Germany. Furthermore, the King of Denmark had territorial ambitions against the Habsburgs. In 1625, Christian IV entered Lower Saxony and began gathering mercenaries there. He then advanced into Thuringia. General Mansfeld also returned to Germany with his forces to combat the Catholics. Furthermore, Denmark's sovereign asserted claims to territories held by the Habsburgs. By 1625, Christian IV arrived in Lower Saxony, initiating the recruitment of mercenary soldiers within that region, subsequently advancing into Thuringia. Simultaneously, General Mansfeld rejoined his forces in Germany to engage the Catholic army. Ferdinand felt unhappy but couldn't change the situation, because Christian IV, beyond the Danish throne, also held the Holstein Duke title, and by the empire's statutes, was entitled to such actions. Furthermore, the Lower Saxon Protestants selected him as the leader for their regional imperial forces. This led to a strange circumstance where the Danish monarch, preparing to engage in conflict against the Holy Roman Emperor, was assigned a military role within that very same empire. Around that time, A Catholic nobleman from Bohemia named Albrecht von Wallenstein presented an intriguing proposition to Ferdinand. If the emperor lacked the financial means for an additional mercenary force, he could enlist these soldiers by permitting them to plunder and demand payments. The emperor gave his approval, and Wallenstein rapidly assembled 30,000 troops and advanced on the Danish king, devastating the territories as he advanced. In April of 1626, Wallenstein's mercenaries encountered Mansfeld's soldiers near Dessau. Wallenstein maneuvered the opposing forces into a poor position, forcing them to assault a bridge crossing the Elbe River. During these engagements, the Protestants sustained substantial casualties, compelling Mansfeld to withdraw. On his retreat, he lost half his troops due to desertion and minor engagements. With the remaining elements of his command, Mansfeld journeyed toward Hungary. His intention was to combat the Habsburgs from a southern approach, but his precise future strategies remain unclear. Eventually, the Protestant general passed away in late 1626 in Sarajevo. During the summer of that year, Count Tilly secured a victory for the Catholic side at the Battle of Lutter. The Danish forces lost 1/3 of their soldiers and all their cannon. The Danish king relinquished control over Lower Saxony and returned to his home country. By the close of 1627, Catholic armies had fully occupied Jutland. Wallenstein captured Mecklenburg and laid siege to Stralsund there. The general required naval vessels for an assault on the Danish islands, where he intended to defeat Christian IV. The Danish monarch anticipated these moves by landing in Mecklenburg himself, but faced another defeat and then sought peace. An agreement was finalized in Lübeck. Christian IV abandoned his claims. Wallenstein was granted the duchies of Friedland and Mecklenburg, subsequently withdrawing from military engagements. Emperor Ferdinand II issued a directive for the restoration of previous territories and rights to the Catholic Church, and he was already preparing to commemorate his success. At that period, the remainder of Europe viewed Sweden as an impoverished and underdeveloped nation, whose military presented no challenge to the victorious Catholic legions. However, the Swedes enacted a significant transformation in military practices. Rather than depending on hired soldiers, Sweden created its military from its general populace, enlisting fighters for extended duty. This framework enabled the Swedes to maintain a ready fighting force of 45,000 men. Sweden's King Gustav II Adolf had earned renown as a skilled military leader from a young age. Given the Danish king's setbacks, France aimed to establish an alliance with the Swedes, hoping they would spearhead the conflict against the Habsburgs. Paris pledged to the Swedish sovereign financial support for mercenaries and to act as a mediator with the German Protestant princes. Gustav II Adolf, a devout Protestant, was keen to fight the Catholic Habsburgs, even though he was being financed by the Catholic Bourbons. In the summer of 1630, King Gustav disembarked in Pomerania, specifically Usedom Island, with his army. By hiring German mercenaries, he boosted his numbers to 40,000 troops and besieged Frankfurt an der Oder to secure a base for advancing into German territory. During this time frame, German Protestants started defecting to the Swedish side, with the city of Magdeburg being among the first to do so. Count Tilly was determined not to let such a crucial city fall, as its capture would clear a path for the Swedes into the heartland of Germany. Consequently, the Catholic forces laid siege to Magdeburg. Although Frankfurt surrendered earlier, the Swedes were unable to reach Magdeburg in time to help, and in May 1631, imperial troops seized and looted the city. Nearly all of its inhabitants were eradicated. This event, known as Magdeburg's Wedding, marked the most brutal period of the 30 Years' War. Count Tilly sought to prevent the Elector of Saxony, Johann Georg Urs, from joining the Swedes. so he personally led his soldiers into Saxony. Nevertheless, the fate of Magdeburg only intensified Johann Georg Joer's resolve to ally with the Swedes. This gave Tilly's army the chance to loot Leipzig. However, the Catholic forces could not savor their gains for long. Merely 3 days later, the Swedish army approached and defeated the Catholics at the Battle of Breitenfeld. Saxony was liberated from the Catholic army, and the Protestants achieved their initial significant triumph in the conflict. The Catholic success in the minor Battle of Bamberg could not impede the Swedish advance. Just 1 month thereafter, King Gustavus inflicted a defeat upon Count Tilly along the Rhine River. Here, the Finnish cavalry distinguished themselves, leading the vanguard of the Swedish army's successful charge. The Catholic army was almost entirely destroyed, and Tilly sustained a fatal injury. As a direct consequence, the Swedes gained access to Vienna. Faced with such a dire predicament, Emperor Ferdinand once again called upon Wallenstein. Employing the identical recruitment strategy, he rapidly amassed 50,000 soldiers and proceeded towards Bavaria. Through skillful tactics, he positioned a small contingent to block Gustavus II's route in Nuremberg. The Swedish monarch was only spared disaster by the arrival of his primary army. Yet, even with his reinforcements, he could not overcome Wallenstein at the Battle of Fruth, compelling the Swedes to fall back northward. Wallenstein then embarked on a pursuit of them. In November, following extended maneuvers, the opposing forces converged in Saxony near Lutzen. Gustavus II Adolf was anticipating the arrival of his Protestant allies, but upon learning of Wallenstein's proximity, he opted to launch an assault, hoping to exploit the element of surprise to vanquish the Catholics. He successfully achieved his objective. Wallenstein's forces incurred substantial losses and withdrew from the engagement. Nevertheless, the victory came at a considerable price for the Swedes, including the demise of their king. Following the passing of the beloved monarch, the Swedish enthusiasm for the ongoing war noticeably diminished. German mercenaries started gaining prominence within the Swedish military ranks. One among them, Bernard of Saxe-Weimar, assumed the actual leadership of the Protestant armies. He was a young officer, not yet having reached the age of 30, although he had undergone military instruction within the forces of General Ernst von Mansfeld and Kings Christian IV and Gustav II. Bernard reignited the offensive toward the Danube region, and in November 1633, after 3 attempts, he successfully captured Regensburg. The aristocracy in Vienna harbored ill feelings towards Albrecht von Wallenstein. To their perception, he was an inexperienced upstart who had merely experienced good fortune. The emperor frequently received reports that Wallenstein was contemplating treason, either by defecting to the Protestant side or by seizing control of the empire himself. Following the setback at Lutzen, the commander's influence began to wane. When the emperor discovered his clandestine discussions with the Protestants, he ordered his execution. Wallenstein was assassinated by his own guards while en route to Vienna. Wallenstein's army was absorbed into the imperial forces and augmented with hired Spanish tercios, recognized as the most proficient units within the Catholic League. The newly formed army was placed under the command of Prince Ferdinand. He had received military training under Wallenstein's guidance and frequently employed his combat strategies. By July 1634, Ferdinand had captured Regensburg, subsequently defeating the Swedish contingent at the Battle of Nordlingen. This defeat proved to be a devastating blow for the Protestants. The Swedes commenced their withdrawal towards Pomerania. The Saxon elector, who had been unwilling to support the Swedes, then shifted his allegiance to the Habsburgs. He even tried to impede the Swedish advance, but following a defeat at Dimetz, he eventually let them proceed northward. the situation was even more dire for the German princes. Left unsupported by the Swedes, they were reluctant to confront the Habsburgs alone. Some, such as Bernard of Saxe-Weimar, looked for an opening towards France. Nevertheless, the majority of Protestants chose to reconcile with the emperor. In 1635, a peace agreement was established in Prague, reinstating the Holy Roman Empire to its pre-30 Years' War status. However, this accord did not conclude the war. For an extended period during this conflict, France merely provided financial backing to the Habsburg dynasty's adversaries to weaken them. Internal strife and the competition for power in Italy kept the French from fully engaging in the war. But once the German Protestants sought a peace agreement with the emperor, Paris made the decision to enter the conflict. The Habsburg military was already diminished by the lengthy war, and the French anticipated an easy victory. Shortly after declaring hostilities against the Habsburgs, the French army was routed at Les Auvines, leading to a temporary occupation of the Spanish Netherlands. A second French contingent advanced into Italy. However, within a year, the Spanish-German forces, under the command of Fernando of Austria, successfully recaptured their territories and subsequently launched an invasion into France itself, reaching towns like Somme and Gobi, from which they posed a threat to Paris. At that same time, General Matthias Gallus initiated an invasion of Burgundy. France found itself perilously close to defeat. The French were rescued by the Swedes, with whom they had recently formed an alliance. In 1636, the Swedish army, commanded by General Johan Baena, initiated a military campaign. The Swedes achieved victory over the Saxons at the Battle of Wittstock, and subsequently took control of Saxony, Thuringia, and Hesse. The Habsburgs were compelled to recall General Gallus back to Germany, where he encountered substantial challenges in retaking territories from the Swedish forces. This was sufficient for the French to recapture Corbie and expel the enemy from their homeland. Once again, Bernard von Saxe-Weimar distinguished himself. With his troops bolstered by French support, he successfully seized Alsace. The conflict then shifted back towards the Holy Roman Empire. The French also aimed to extend the fighting into Spain. During the summer of 1638, they managed to destroy the Spanish naval fleet near Guetaria. Nevertheless, on land, they experienced a defeat and were forced to withdraw. Far more crucial for the war's progression were the developments along the Rhine. Here, General Saxe-Weimar crossed the Rhine and overcame the imperial forces in the Battle of Rheinfelden. After a 6-month siege of Breisach, he captured the city, paving the way for French penetration into Germany. However, the prince tragically died under uncertain circumstances, and his soldiers then pledged their loyalty to France. The first to traverse the Rhine was the French army led by Duc de Longueville, though the actual command resided with the young Count de Gabriond, who would later be granted the title of Marshal for his leadership in this campaign. Following the occupation of the Palatinate, he advanced to join forces with the Swedes. During this period, the Swedish militaries succeeded in defeating General Gallus, conquering and pillaging Bohemia, and, alongside the French, executed a raid on Regensburg, during which they lost their commander, who succumbed to cirrhosis. In the summer of 1641, the combined Franco-Swedish army vanquished the Bavarians before subsequently dividing. The subsequent year, Count de Gabriond decisively defeated the Habsburg forces at the Battle of Kempen, while Lennart Torstensson secured a victory against the Catholic troops in the Second Battle of Breitenfeld. The French also anticipated considerable triumphs on other battlefronts. In Italy, as early as 1640, Viscount de Turenne captured the city of Turin. On the Iberian Peninsula, the Portuguese, capitalizing on Madrid's weakened state, revolted and diverted Spanish attention By 1641, French soldiers had fully subdued the county of Artois. A year later, in the north, they seized the Principality of Sedan, and in the south, they conquered Roussillon. The objective of conquering Roussillon was to ultimately capture Barcelona, where the French received vital support from Catalan separatist movements. Yet, this protracted war continued until 1659, and France ultimately failed to secure Barcelona. In 1643, the Spanish army launched a second invasion of France from the northern sector. French forces, under the command of Duke Louis II of Condé-Bourbon, marched out to confront them. Despite his youth, he demonstrated considerable skill as a commander. In the Battle of Rocroi, the French forces initially implemented linear infantry tactics, which would be adopted by European armies well into the late 19th century. The Spanish forces suffered a devastating loss in this engagement, effectively removing them from active participation in combat for an extended duration. Duke Condé-Bourbon returned to Paris amidst widespread celebration. The final hope for the Habsburgs rested with the Bavarian forces, led by the exceptionally skilled commander, Franz von Mercy, who hailed from Lorraine. In 1643, he achieved victory over a French army of 15,000 soldiers, comprising former mercenaries formerly under Bernard of Saxe-Weimar at the Battle of Tuttlingen, and subsequently took control of Freiburg. Consequently, Louis II of Condé-Bourbon journeyed to Germany to personally assume command. During the summer of 1644, the French forces engaged imperial troops just outside the fortifications of Freiburg. At the expense of suffering twice the casualties of their adversary, the French forces emerged victorious. However, while retreating, von Mercy skillfully lured Marshal de Turenne into an ambush and defeated him at the Battle of Mergentheim. While the Bavarian army was occupied confronting the French in the Western Theater, Swedish General Torstensson commenced an invasion of Bohemia. He initiated a siege of Prague and, by the spring of 1645, achieved a decisive victory over imperial troops at the Battle of Jankau. The Swedish forces then proceeded to occupy Bohemia for a second instance. Meanwhile, the French forces began their advance, swiftly conquering territories within Germany. Von Mercy made an effort to halt their progress. In the Second Battle of Nördlingen, he inflicted considerable damage upon the French forces, but tragically lost his life in the conflict. Following the demise of their commander, the Bavarian troops formally surrendered. Louis II de Condé-Bourbon returned to France. For him, as a Frenchman, the war aimed at France's territorial expansion held greater importance than the political objectives in Germany. In 1646, he initiated a siege of the port city of Dunkirk. To establish a complete blockade of Dunkirk, the French were required to charter Dutch vessels. Following intense combat, the French compelled the Spanish defenders to relinquish control of the fortress. On this occasion, Dunkirk remained under French control for a period of only 6 years. At this juncture in Germany, combined Franco-Swedish forces, under the leadership of Marshal de Turenne and General Wrangel, were making preparations for a military campaign targeting Austria. Recognizing the precariousness of their situation, the Bavarian elector formally requested a peace agreement. Nevertheless, merely 1 year later, after having regrouped his forces, he disregarded that peace treaty and attempted to seize control of Magdeburg. The military operation proved to be unsuccessful, and shortly thereafter, the French and Swedish armies launched a retaliatory offensive, resulting in the defeat of the imperial forces. The French occupied Bavaria, while the Swedes gained control of Bohemia. With these developments, the Allies now had an unobstructed path towards Vienna. In reaction to this, Emperor Ferdinand I formally requested peace negotiations. Concurrently, the emperor's younger sibling, Leopold Wilhelm of Habsburg, attempted a third invasion of France from the northern direction. Nevertheless, his military contingent was decisively defeated by Prince Condé at the Battle of Lens. Meanwhile, the commander of the Catholic army, Piccolomini, succeeded in recapturing Bavaria. Negotiations had commenced as early as 1644, but each party deliberately prolonged them, hoping to achieve more favorable terms. As the conflict was quite prolonged, numerous peace agreements were put in place in Westphalian cities to bring it to a close. For this reason, this settlement is referred to as the Peace of Westphalia. This agreement affirmed the concept of equal standing for both Protestants and Catholics within the Holy Roman Empire. Local German rulers were given the freedom to manage their political affairs as they saw fit. Certain regions, including Saxony and Brandenburg, successfully grew their land holdings. Sweden secured control over Bremen and parts of western Pomerania, whereas France, still engaged in conflict with Spain, took over territories in Lorraine and Alsace. The Habsburg dynasty had to officially acknowledge the autonomy of both Switzerland and the Netherlands. What started as a religious dispute ultimately transformed into a bid for dominance in Europe, and ultimately proved disastrous for Germany. Much of the country's territory was left in ruins by the fighting. The number of inhabitants decreased by a third, with some locations experiencing a drop of up to 50%. The Westphalian peace reinforced the existing divisions, thereby delaying the unification of a German state for an additional 2 centuries.